What do medieval warfare, labor strikes, and Buddhism have in common? That's what this video is about. In the movies, we like to imagine giant clashes between armies. You think of like Narnia or attacking the Black Gate in The Lord of the Rings, where there's this massive CGI army and the massive CGI army here, and they just run toward each other and they clash, and there's lots of individual dueling that happens between people wearing swords and armor. Most of medieval warfare didn't actually look like this. It was sieges, and a siege is where you have a castle or some kind of fortification, and the people inside of it don't want to fight because they might die. And if they're not sure they can win the fight, they hole up in this thing and they wait. And then the army on the outside has a hard time getting past the walls, and so they wait on the outside and they cut off all of the access to resources that that city has. And then it becomes a waiting game. And there are things that you can do to upset the waiting game, like tunneling under the walls or throwing massive rocks over the parapet. But for the most part, it's a waiting game where the army on the inside is trying to outlast the army on the outside. And what does outlast actually mean? It means that it's a duel of the pantries. On the inside of this castle, you have access to some amount of food and water and weapons that have been saved up. And they are eating that food, and it's slowly running out. And you need food to live. This is a dependency that all human beings have. And you need water to live, and it needs to be clean. And you need to be able to take care of your sanitary needs, like having a place for the sewage to go. So you're in this castle, and you're eating food, and you're hoping that you have enough food to outlast the enemy. Meanwhile, on the outside, you have the army that's attacking, and they've cut off all of the roads that are letting food into your castle under normal circumstances. And the way they operate is they need to feed the army. Armies march on their stomachs. So they need to be able to keep supplied, and they need to have good enough morale to be able to maintain the effort of keeping the siege and keeping the people inside threatened enough that they don't just run out and attack. So you've got this super tense situation where both sides are sending forays against each other, little skirmishes, and both sides are trying to pick each other off, but mostly it's a duel of the pantries and who can last longer in terms of their food and the morale that comes largely from the food. And meanwhile, both of you are also grappling with disease. This was a problem in Homer's The Iliad. You have Apollo shooting disease among the besieging army. So that's kind of how that works. It's a waiting game. You know what else is a waiting game that operates in a very similar way? Labor strikes. When you have a labor strike, you have employees who believe that they are not being fairly treated, not being paid what they are worth. And so what they do is refuse to work. And now we have a waiting game where both sides need each other. The employer needs the employee to do the work, or else the work doesn't get done and the employer doesn't make any money. The factory needs to be operating, or else it doesn't make any money. So they have an incentive to get stuff back up and running. The employees have weaponized the fact that they themselves are something the corporation is dependent on to get the product made, in order to get the wheels of the machinery of production to move. Meanwhile, if you're not working, you're not making money. And so you're dipping into your savings further and further and further, and it becomes a waiting game where you see whose pantry is going to give out first, whose dependency is going to hurt them more. This is the same thing that works with tariffs. When you're applying tariffs against a foreign country in order to get them to bend, that actually hurts you economically as well. And it's a case of, I am willing to bleed in order to make you break. This is the way that siege warfare operates. The core principle in siege warfare and in labor strikes like this is that anything that you are dependent on can be weaponized against you. It is a point of vulnerability. The core idea of Buddhism, as I understand it, is that life involves suffering. In fact, you could say that life is suffering. And suffering is uncomfortable and awful. Wouldn't it be nice if we could find a way to be elevated and, enlightened past our suffering, to achieve a state of bliss called nirvana? How do you get there? Well, you need to understand where the suffering comes from. Suffering comes from attachment. If there is a thing that you cannot lose, and you lose it, that is the source of pain. If there is a thing that you need and you don't get it, that is the source of pain. If you are attached to something and desire it, then that's a thing that can be used against you. That's a thing that can be weaponized. You can experience disappointment as soon as you have hope. You can experience hunger as soon as you desire food. And these dependencies are a thing that practitioners of Buddhism desire to eliminate or separate from or elevate into the mind enough that you don't feel them so intensely, and therefore you can achieve a sense of detachment that brings a sense of peace. I want to play around with that idea. There is a lot of wisdom there. I don't think it's the full picture because you can never get rid of all dependencies, and I don't know that I want to, because desire, while it can introduce pain, is also where all the good things in life come from. I desire stuff, I want stuff, and I'm grateful that I have the opportunity to, through my own action, do things to get closer to those desires. I don't want to detach completely from desire itself. I want to retain attachment to my wife and my children and my life and my ideals and this desire I have to live in the world, be prosperous, and make something better out of it. But what I do want to play around with is this idea that dependencies can be, for lack of a better word, weaponized. They can be the source of pain. And if you want an additional layer of freedom and security, you need to be aware of these dependencies at the very least. I mean, I am human, I need to eat. That's not a dependency that I can wish away. But being aware of that dependency allows me to say, hey, I am not only dependent on food, I'm also dependent right now on grocery stores. And grocery stores are dependent on supply chains. And those supply chains are dependent on more parts of the supply chain, like the price of fertilizer, price of gas, what's going on in the bond market, all this stuff. And that's an awful lot of dependencies. If I grow a garden, I still have a lot of dependencies. I still need to eat food or I die, and that food that I'm growing still needs the weather to cooperate in order to grow, and it needs water, and it needs sunshine, and it needs lots of stuff. But that list is a whole lot shorter and a whole lot less complicated and a little bit more within my grasp. And that could bring some comfort. One of my favorite economists, Ralph Borsodi, noted that homesteading brought an awful lot of security, partially because it dovetailed so nicely with the life that we already live. He was imagining something like a labor conflict where you have a strike. Now, normally, strikes can cause a lot of problem. This is something Booker T. Washington noted, is that you go on strike and you dip into your savings and then conditions don't improve all that much and you come to some negotiation, the factory comes back to work, and now you're not that much improved, but you've lost your savings, and so you have to scrimp and save to get some savings, and then you go and strike again, which doesn't really help much. But one thing Borsodi noted was if you had a homestead, if you had a garden in the back and some food storage laid away and some savings that were built up a little bit, but let's just focus on the garden. If you had a good garden, how long can you go without income, at least as far as food is concerned? Depending on how good of a gardener you are, that could either be a short bonus or indefinite. Which means suddenly I can play this game forever. I can do this all day. And the factory can't. At that point, labor becomes way stronger by virtue of having access at home to the means of producing some food. That is an incredibly cool idea, and I think it's powerful. If you are aware of your dependencies, you can work around them and find ways of satisfying them that are a little bit closer to home. That is the connection between siege warfare and labor strikes and Buddhism that I find so interesting. All dependencies can be weaponized. Being aware of your dependencies gives you a degree of power and freedom that you don't have if you just blindly allow yourself to be dependent on things without thinking about them. You're never going to eliminate dependency. I don't think that's necessarily a bad thing. I think a lot of the meaning in life comes from the burdens we carry, and that includes a lot of things that we're dependent on. But it's not always nice to be dependent on things that may not have your best interests at heart. Regaining some of that control over your dependencies can bring an added measure of security and comfort and peace, dare we say it. Maybe even just a little bit of nirvana. If you enjoyed this video, please hit the like button and subscribe below. As always, we appreciate you watching and look forward to seeing you next time.